Hello. Several of you had requested a little video talking about how you might analyze the Jessica Enoch article, Becoming Symbol-Wise, Kenneth Burke's Pedagogy of Critical Reflection. So I'm going to walk you through how I would identify the moves that Enoch is making. So in other words, what she's doing when she does the analysis, the rhetorical analysis of Kenneth Burke's work. And so I'm just going to walk you step by step through what those moves are fairly quickly in this article. So some of you identified that she first sets up the rhetorical situation around the text itself. And so that's what those first few paragraphs are setting up. She's introducing the text that she's going to use for the bulk of her analysis. She's putting it in the context of Burke's rhetorical relationship to war, which is she's doing right here, and then kind of putting it in terms of his research and his writing as well. So this very first part is really setting up why war was such a driving motivation for Burke and giving the rhetorical context for this particular article, the LAPE article that she's going to be analyzing. So here she kind of gives a summary of what the main points of that article were and why he wrote it. And then she's giving her thesis. So let's see, thesis is coming a couple paragraphs, 2, maybe 3 paragraphs into her essay. So one of the elements that you might talk about is that the thesis statement for your rhetorical analysis, you might give a paragraph or 2 of summary of your rhetorical context. And then you're going to want to give a specific thesis. And she's saying is defining Burke's work in LAPE as a pedagogy of critical reflection that speaks not only to his 1955 world, but also to our own. And that's the connection in rhetorical analysis you want to make between the work that you're doing and its relevance in the world today. So why is it important that we look at and frame this rhetorical act in terms of a context today? And that'll be one of the arguments you want to make for why you're doing the rhetorical analysis that you're doing. So here she gives an overview of what she is doing. So first she's going to examine the 1955 pedagogical theory and the 3 practices. Then she's going to discuss the way Burke's theory and practice provide a productive link between RHET comp and critical pedagogy. And then she's really specifically going to explore the way that Burke connects to Paulo Freire. So if you were translating that into the rhetorical analysis that you'll be doing, you'll be setting up that same thing. First, you might examine a text, an artifact, some kind of specific thing to establish the rhetorical act itself. What she's doing here is discussing his pedagogical theory really as a rhetorical document. Then connecting that, she's talking about productive link between the fields of rhetoric and composition and critical pedagogy. She's making a connection between one area and another. And then more specifically, she's making a connection not just to rhetoric and composition, but really to Paulo Freire. So she's making a connection between Burke as a theorist, educational theorist, Freire as an educational theorist. And then she's kind of giving us here in these last few paragraphs before the first main section break, just kind of a really short lit review. So look at this has already been done by all these people, and she's just mentioning them here. So she's saying these are the scholars that have done work in this area already. I'm not coming at it by myself. She's not going into really the work they do. She's just acknowledging that other people have also done this work. And then talking again about how we should be thinking about it in terms of the modern day. And modern day for her is 2004, because that's when she was writing this article. So if you're looking at rhetorical analysis, always think about it not only in the terms of the context of 1955 in this case for the article you're analyzing, but also in terms of the present day or the day in which the analysis itself is written. So that's to set up why she's doing it, who's done things like that before, and making the connections between what she's analyzing and the theories that she's connecting it to. Then she really goes into this kind of long section on Burke as educator, which is really, and some of you pointed out this in two different ways. It's expanding on that rhetorical context. It's giving us a background about Burke and why he is an educational theorist as well as a rhetorician, because she said in the beginning she's wanting to reframe that from this kind of Burke as a reclusive genius to Burke as a scholar of pedagogy. So she's expanding on that first point. And she's also really analyzing the ethos of Burke here. So she's not only setting him up as an educator, but she's really saying that he was promoting an idea that demonstrated his ethos through the way that he performed this rhetorical act. So it's a really interesting argument that she's making here. So if you look down here, for example, she's saying, although professors like Brown, Cochrane, and Ben saw Burke's pedagogical program as a departure from traditional practices, Burke's educational theory was not wholly unique. So she's connecting him here to John Dewey, which would actually be analyzing his ethos in terms of who he is similar to. He has been carrying through this tradition that goes back to John Dewey, which is, as you know, one of the people in educational theory. So again, she's elaborating on that some more, bringing her talk of Burke's ethos back around to the object she is going to analyze. So thus, when Burke submitted LAPE to the National Society for the Study of Education yearbook, he had already appreciated Dewey's all-encompassing influence inside education and now joined with other contributors to the volume who pointed to Dewey as the major figure of the 20th century educational philosophy. So again, bringing it back around to the object that she's going to analyze. And the bulk of the rhetorical analysis here is that focus, Burke's problems of education and his solutions. So she's going to look at exactly what that artifact says, how it says it, what it sets up, why it's doing what it does, and that is the bulk of this article. So you've already read this, but she's basically just setting up what the theory was that he outlined in that article. He's talking about dramatism in terms of the analysis, and it's basically kind of this extended summary or overview of what his educational system was as it was put in place at the time. And as several of you pointed out, she really easily breaks that down into these three sections that comprise the three parts of this method that he talks about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this midsection because I think it's fairly evident. I think a lot of you picked up on those three sections and really elaborated on what those did in the argument. So once she gets kind of the summary of that text out, she's starting to make connections between that and composition and rhetoric's move toward the pedagogy of critical reflection, which is Freirean language. So here she's connecting that artifact, connecting his educational theory and practice to another concept, critical reflection. So you might take a different artifact, and at this point in your analysis, you would be done talking about the artifact and would start connecting it to a theory. So maybe you take the transcript of Hillary Clinton's Benghazi testimony and look at it through the frame of feminism or narrative theory. Just some kind of a rhetorical context that you're going to put over that to kind of analyze it. And so what she's doing here is thinking about a pedagogy of critical reflection, which would be connecting it to the theory of critical reflection on Freire's work. So basically this next section is making that connection complete. So she's pulling in other experts here who have done this kind of work, Henry Giraud, Dewey and Gramsci, working in other theories and theorists to highlight how Burke fits into these practitioners, these people using this pedagogy. So the point she's kind of coming to is indicated here in this sentence. Through recovering Burke's pedagogy of critical reflection, a primary step in Freire's praxis or his reflection can be remade. So one of the primary issues with Freirean concepts of praxis and the way that Freire sets up his method is that it works really well in the third world, but we in the first world have trouble implementing that because we're working with an entirely different set of students. And the argument that she's really making is that we can use Burke much like scholars in the third world might use for error to be able to reach the students that we have here in the US or in the first world. So she's going on here to further outline what Freire's methods are, what his basic pedagogy was that attaches itself to Burke or compares to Burke. And I'm trying to get to the next part. Toward the end here, what she's saying is then what would happen as a result of this connection. So what do we learn from this connection that we can take and apply to something else? So at the end she's saying here, in such a Burkean spirit then, the rhetoric and composition classroom would make its own attitudinal shift. This dramatistic classroom would be a place where the various persuasions are brought together, and the topic that would surely transcend them all would be the question of persuasion itself. The course's focus would change dramatically and dramatistically, as it would necessarily highlight and foreground reflection, and as Burke suggests, the theoretical study of all forms of persuasion. So she's coming to get back around to say the reason that it's important that we look at this text, that we compare it to Freire, who was very prominent in the field, especially in that in 2004 at the time she was writing, is that what she's saying is we can use this text and reframing this text, this rhetorical statement by Burke, in order to impact our students in our own lives in important ways. So this Burkean pedagogy of critical reflection would teach students to become symbol-wise by encouraging them to adopt an attitude of patience and withdrawal, an attitude that necessitates waiting, listening, reflecting, and analyzing before any arguments are made or action is taken. So your rhetorical analysis, after you go through highlighting and outlining what the rhetorical document says or the rhetorical act says, connecting it to that theory, and then at the end, here's why this is important. Here's why it's important that we look at Hillary Clinton's testimony through a feminist frame. This is what it teaches us about our classrooms, about our lives, about the way that we communicate. So that would be how you would look at how the article is doing what it's doing. The audience that she's writing to is important. She's writing in a pretty prominent composition and rhetoric journal, college composition and communication. She's talking to teachers who would know who Burke is, who would know who Freire is, who might not have necessarily made that connection because they see Burke primarily as a rhetorician instead of a pedagogue. So I hope that helps you to see how you can do kind of an analysis of an analysis. I like using Enoch's text because it provides us a little different model of rhetorical analysis than what we might normally see. Certainly different than Rowland and Jones, but this is one model that you can use to help set up your own rhetorical analysis for the end of the course.